a daughter of Queen Victoria should have meant living a fairy tale life full of wealth, power and love. Instead, she lived a life of betrayal, loss and tragic endings. This is part 1 of the forgotten story of Princess Alice. She was born a royal disappointment from the moment of birth. She was the 3rd child, and after a son was born last time, the public eagerly awaited the birth of another son and heir to the throne. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. However, this was not to be when she was born a girl, Princess Alice, on the 25th of April 1843 at Buckingham Palace. Her birth was not a happy occasion. The Privy Council even sent a letter to her father, giving congratulation and condolence. Her life was different than people imagine a princess would live. She lived with parents who were obsessed with each other, but also obsessed with their children being the best that they could. Prince Albert developed the children's education, and it was a strict system that had to be stuck to. Alice and siblings dressed in practical, humble clothing, and they lived in unadorned lodgings without regular heating, as their mother preferred the cold. Alice was different from her siblings. She was extremely empathetic. She was one of the middle children of the large royal brood, and she got along with all of them, although she did have a closer bond with her older siblings, Vicky and Edward. Alice wanted more than her royal lifestyle. She wanted to experience a life outside of her royal family. She liked to visit the working-class tenants at Balmoral and find out how they lived. This desire to see how other people lived led to her escaping her governess one day in order to attend a local church and sit in the pews rather than attend her royal mass at Windsor Castle Chapel. This hinted at her rebellious side. As everybody has, Alice has 2 sides to her. She was dependable and empathetic, but she could also have a temper. This was perhaps learnt as a way to protect herself as a middle child that would have been up against her other headstrong and opinionated siblings. She was known to lash out with her tongue when she was angry with her siblings, and this only got worse over the years. When Alice was old enough and her mother deemed her fit for marital matchmaking, it was decided that she would be married while still a teenager. Her sister had just married Frederick of Prussia in 1858, and now it was time for her to be matched to an eligible bachelor. Victoria was keen on a love match for her daughter, so long as it was one of the eligible European royal houses. This did not leave a large scope for a real love match, and the options were very far and few. Alice's newlywed sister Vicky was in charge of compiling a list of eligible European bachelors. She only found 2 men suitable: William the Prince of Orange and Prince Albert of Prussia. Albert of Prussia was also Vicky's husband's cousin, and when Princess Alice was set up to meet these suitors, she was not happy with it at all. The family of the Prince of Orange were beside themselves with glee at the prospect of him marrying an English princess, and so he travelled from the Netherlands to Windsor Castle to meet the potential bride and her mother-in-law. Alice was brutal in her response, and she was not keen at all, and she told her mother she did not like him at all. Her second match seemed even more unsuitable because she was far too good for him. The second suitor was recommended as the cousin of Alice's new brother-in-law, Frederick. But Frederick himself claimed his cousin wasn't good enough for Alice, who deserves the very best. Her options were now down to 0, but there was another man, an underdog of a suitor. Her sister Vicky started to rack her brain for another match after her first 2 choices crashed and burned. Eventually she landed on Prince Louis of Hesse. He came from a respectable German house, and Queen Victoria invited him to Windsor Castle to meet his future bride. She liked him immediately, and the sparks were flying. They got on amazingly in each other's company. Upon his departure, he asked for her autograph as a keepsake, and Alice was impressed with him. Queen Victoria immediately made plans to marry the pair, but then tragedy struck and her grandmother died. Princess Alice was immensely happy during the spring of 1861. She had met her life love and had gotten engaged in the April to Prince Louis. But it was also full of sorrow for her maternal grandmother, the Duchess of Kent, when she died in her bed. Alice wasn't just close to the Duchess, she had also taken up the job of nursing her in her final weeks of life, and so she had to watch as her grandmother deteriorated before sadly passing away. Her looking after her family members did not stop there. She took on the role of family caregiver. When her mother struggled with her emotions, she was sent by her father to comfort her. But tragedy struck again. Her father became gravely ill, and again she took on the role of looking after him. On December 1861, Alice's father, Albert, fell dangerously ill, with complications from undiagnosed Crohn's disease. The prince had struggled with his health throughout his whole life, but he had been particularly stressed out with the debauched behaviours of his son, Edward, who had been parading his mistresses in public. Queen Victoria and Princess Alice believed they could save Albert by tending and caring for him, but their hope vanished when he passed away from his illness. The fallout from his death plunged the public and the royal family into a deep state of mourning. Queen Victoria blamed her son for killing her husband due to the stress he had brought to his door. She even refused to notify her heir of his father's death. Alice was not one for tensions in the family, but she was struggling with the morality of not telling her brother of her father's death, and so she betrayed her mother when she went behind her back to sneak a telegram to Edward. Victoria and Edward never fully reconciled with the Queen, remarking that, "I never can or shall look at Edward without a shudder." This act of rebellion meant that her relationship with her mother was forever tarnished, but Alice had more to worry about than this. Her grandmother and father had not long died, but she was still planning the wedding to her true love, Prince Louis of Hesse, and so she got married among the most tragic time during the Victorian era. In pure British fashion, and with a stiff upper lip, Queen Victoria insisted that the ceremony go ahead even after Prince Albert passed. The wedding went ahead on the 1st of July 1862, but it was not the fairy tale wedding she had hoped. It was more of an extension of the family's mourning than a wedding. Alice should have gotten married and it should have been the happiest day of her life, but it turned more into a nightmare. The whole palace was still in the depths of mourning for Prince Albert, and no one was trying to hide it. Her large opulent wedding was downsized from a church to converting the dining room of her childhood home into a chapel. Not only was her wedding much smaller than anticipated, she also wore black at her wedding. She arrived to the ceremony in a white gown with a lace veil and an orange blossom and myrtle classic bouquet that represented a royal getting married. But Queen Victoria demanded that everyone adhere to mourning protocol and forced everybody to wear black before and immediately after the wedding. The Queen made the wedding all about her, her feelings and her presence. The Queen had her sons take her into the makeshift chapel. She had them stand in front of her to shield her from prying eyes throughout the entire ceremony. While the pair married, the monarch sat in an armchair near the altar and tried not to cry. The nuptials were miserable, with the Queen even noting that it was more of a funeral than a wedding. The poet Alfred, Lord Tennyson, said, "It was the saddest day that I can remember." The wedding was finished by 4 p.m, and when the evening began to slow down, Queen Victoria gave her a gift. Victoria presented Princess Alice with a gold bracelet inlaid with pearls and diamonds. It was from both of her parents, and it was inscribed with the words, "To dear Alice, from your loving parents, Albert and Victoria, are who thou, visibly parted, are ever united." With the miserable day over with, Alice could finally look forward to her honeymoon, but unfortunately this was no better than the wedding. Alice had a miserable wedding, but she was living a happy marriage with her new husband. She was extremely happy, and this made things difficult with her mother, who was grieving her husband. The monarch was jealous of Alice's happy, content life, and so the princess had to try to not look too happy when she was around her mother. It was a difficult start to her married life and her relationship with her mother, but it would take a much darker turn. Alice moved to Louis's home in Darmstadt. As royal brides often do, she had to move out of the family home and into the family of her new husband's household. She arrived there in 1862 and crowds of people welcomed her with cheers, and she wrote to Queen Victoria, "I believe the people never gave so hearty a welcome." Despite the warm welcome from the people, Alice was extremely homesick. She was also bored of her new life, but she shouldn't have worried about being bored. Join me in part 2 to learn of how Alice experienced further loss with the death of her own children before also losing her own life too. Her father-in-law disgraced her, and Hesse simply couldn't accommodate someone of Alice's considerable rank. Queen Victoria had envisioned Alice getting a newly built pristine palace over there, but that's not what happened. Prince Louis's father had inadequate and declining resources, and he refused to waste what little wealth he had left to find or build the newlyweds appropriate lodgings. Instead, Alice and her groom lived in a simple house overlooking a street in the rambling old quarter of Darmstadt. This was a far cry away from what she was used to in England. Despite this, Alice tried to be accommodating and she tried her hardest to fit in. As soon as she started to fit in, her personal life imploded. As was expected of her, she started getting pregnant and giving birth to babies right after the wedding, having 2 children, Victoria and Elizabeth, within the first 2 years of marriage. This caused some tension with her mother. Alice was passionate about breastfeeding her babies, which was less common at the time, but the most resistance she experienced came from her own mother, who hated the thought of her daughter doing it. As the years wore on, though, the Queen took her displeasure to new heights. Princess Alice was confident and comfortable in her own skin, and she also admired the bodies of others. She took up a strong interest in nursing, and she even became friends with the famous Florence Nightingale. This traumatized her mother, who was so horrified she wrote a warning to Alice's younger sister Louise about Alice's perverse interests. The Queen was wary that Alice would take a gynecological stance with the princess, and so the Queen insisted, "Don't let Alice pump you. Be very silent and cautious about your interior." There was an ulterior motive behind her actions with her daughter, and that was because she was a very jealous woman. She struggled with the idea of Alice being happy, and Victoria didn't want to let her daughter go, because she was so utterly miserable herself. Her response to this was to snipe at her instead, and each year the sniping worsened. Alice was content and happy with her children. She visited England less and less, and the Queen struggled seeing Alice happy. But she didn't have to wait long to see her miserable, because on the 7th of October 1870, Alice gave birth to her second son and fifth child, Frederick, aka Fritty. The new baby was the family's favourite, but something was seriously wrong with him, due to a genetic condition that the Queen had passed down to her own children called haemophilia. This prevents blood clotting in male children, and she had passed it right down to Alice and then to little Fritty. The royal disease was being passed down all over Europe due to the many marriages that were arranged by Victoria, and as a male with the disease, it was nothing less than a death sentence at the time. This disease went on to kill Alice's brother, Leopold, in 1884. Unsurprisingly, everyone feared the worst for the princeling Frederick, who would go on to die in a devastating way. On the 29th of May 1873, the little boy fell 20 feet from his window when he was hanging out of it at home. The fall would have injured and could have been fatal for any child, but coupled with this royal disease meant he stood no chance at all. The boy did not die on impact. He awoke after the fall, but even the best doctors in the land couldn't control his internal bleeding, and so he devastatingly passed away, leaving Alice heartbroken. Alice was plagued with grief for years. She never ever got over the loss of her beloved son. She sent a letter to her mother, who was not very empathetic of her grief, only 2 months after the fall, stating, "I am glad you have a little coloured picture of my darling. I feel lower and sadder than ever, and miss him so much, so continually." The years that followed started a dark spiral. Her mother did little to support her, and she was far too filled with jealousy and bitterness that this dominated her emotions towards Alice. Alice was stubborn and they often clashed, but now they would go on to exchange vicious letters. Alice attempted to give some diplomatic advice to Victoria, but the monarch wrote back, "I do not think, dear child, that you should tell me what I ought to do." For 2 years, Alice withdrew from public life to heal herself and look after her remaining 2 girls, Alex and Marie, and her son, Ernest. She used her surviving son to cope with the loss of her other son, and she kept him close by, as well as promoting him to her new favourite and hardly letting him out of her sight. At this time, her marriage was also taking a battering. The problem started out as minimal, but worsened over time. Prince Louis of Hesse was a lovely, kind man. He was also a little soft-headed and could be emotionally stunted, and he offered little support to the struggling princess. She was disappointed with her husband's response to their son's death, and by 1876 she was becoming increasingly full of resentment, and she was not afraid to let him know. She wrote to him accusing him of writing empty and bare letters that left her cold and alienated from her real self, confessing that, "I feel myself through them that I have less to say to you than any other person." Despite the marriage woes, the pair would be catapulted into higher-ranking roles when in 1877 Louis's father passed away, which made them the Grand Duke of Hesse and Alice the Grand Duchess. The pair knew the time would eventually come, but the role was not what Alice expected. She had always struggled to settle into the life in Hesse, and the local people could sense it, describing her as a stiff princess. She had a whole new level of responsibility on her shoulders, and she felt extra pressure to perform as the new head of the country. She wrote to her mother that she dreaded everything, and it was more than she could stand in the long run. Her letters of concern fell on deaf ears with her mother, who did little to comfort her. The Grim Reaper came to her home on a dark, cloudy night in November 1878. Early in the month, Alice's oldest girl, Victoria, took ill with a sore, stiff neck. They were not to know that her diagnosis was terminal and that she had contracted diphtheria, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in the Victorian era. There was not long to get their heads around this, as within days she died. Alice was able to dodge the infection at first, but 4 of her children, Alex, Marie, Irene and Ernest, and even her husband, fell ill within days of Victoria showing no symptoms. Alice was used to caring for others and she tried to make everyone better, but she couldn't. On November the 15th, Alice's youngest daughter, Marie, who was only 4 years old, fell severely ill. The staff gave a grave diagnosis and suggested that the Grand Duchess should attend her bedside to say goodbye. Alice arrived, but unfortunately, before she arrived, Marie had choked, and now her body was already turning cold. She was so devastated by the death of her daughter that she kept it a secret from her other children, so not to dampen their spirits while they were also fighting against the infection. However, she finally gave in to her son Ernest when he wondered where she was. He was so crushed by the news that he required comfort by his mother, who gave him a kiss that would go on to be fatal. Alice had introduced a strict no-contact order in the house, but due to the young boy's grief, she tragically went against this and instead became infected by her son. She contracted the infection shortly after, and on Saturday the 14th of December, Alice fell incredibly ill with diphtheria, so much so that she barely survived for a few more hours. At 2:30 she spoke her heartbreaking last words, whispering "Dear Papa," before losing consciousness and never waking up again on the anniversary of her father's death. She had been reflecting on her father's death while in the grips of the disease, perhaps aware that her end was near too. Her final words were "Dear Papa." Alice's sister Victoria was heartbroken over the death of her sister, but she was banished from attending the funeral due to tensions between the two nations. Queen Victoria outlived her daughter by 2 decades, and Alice had been her first child to die. Queen Victoria, who was always looking for cosmic connections, noticed this connection with her husband, and she called it almost incredible and most mysterious, and lamented that this terrible day come round again. Even after the deaths in the family, the heartache did not end there. Alice and Louis's daughters married into Russian royalty, which ended in tragedy for both of them. Their daughter Alex went on to marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Elizabeth married Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia. Both women were brutally murdered by the Bolsheviks, mercilessly. So were Alex's 5 children. This marked the end of the Romanov dynasty. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.